I sat in my attorney's office signing papers that would change everything while my phone buzzed with text messages from my 3 children, suddenly remembering they had a mother. The irony wasn't lost on me that after 73 years of birthdays, the one day they finally called was the day I was removing them from my will entirely. My attorney, Margaret Chen, slid the final document across her mahogany desk and said quietly, "Are you absolutely certain about this, Mrs. Patterson?" I looked down at the papers that would redirect my entire estate to charity, picked up my favorite Montblanc pen, and signed my name with the same steady hand that had signed birthday cards they never acknowledged for 3 consecutive years. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," I told her, "because forgetting someone's birthday once is an accident, twice is carelessness, but 3 times is a choice." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Lois Patterson, and I'm 73 years old, though I don't feel a day over 50 until I look in the mirror and wonder who that silver-haired woman staring back at me is. I've lived in the same colonial house on Maple Street in Millbrook for 47 years, the one with the wraparound porch where I used to sit with my late husband Frank watching our 3 children play in the yard. Frank passed away 8 years ago from a heart attack that took him so suddenly I barely had time to say goodbye, and since then I've been navigating widowhood with the kind of quiet dignity that comes from a lifetime of putting others before yourself. I raised 3 children in this house. Rebecca, my eldest at 45, who became a successful marketing executive in Chicago, Michael, 42, who runs his own construction company in Denver, and Sarah, my youngest at 38, who works as a pediatric nurse in Boston. I was so proud of them, so certain I had raised them right, taught them about family values and the importance of staying connected. Frank used to joke that I had a 6th sense about birthdays, anniversaries, and every milestone that mattered to our family. I kept a calendar on the kitchen wall with everyone's special dates marked in different colored pens, and I never missed a single one. The first forgotten birthday happened 3 years ago on October 15th. A Tuesday that dawned crisp and golden the way autumn days do in New England. I woke up that morning with the familiar flutter of excitement I'd felt every October 15th since I was a little girl, that special anticipation that comes with knowing it's your day. I made myself blueberry pancakes, the same recipe my mother used to make for my birthday breakfasts, and sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and the morning paper, waiting for the phone to ring. By noon, I told myself they were probably busy with work, that the calls would come later. By 3 o'clock, I was checking my phone to make sure it was working properly, dialing the weather service just to hear the automated voice confirm that yes, the phone was functioning perfectly. By 6 o'clock, I was sitting in my living room staring at the landline and my cell phone, both silent as tombstones, wondering if somehow I had gotten the date wrong. I actually pulled out my birth certificate from the filing cabinet in Frank's old office, just to double-check that October 15th was indeed my birthday, as if 47 years of celebrating it might have been some elaborate mistake. The silence stretched through dinner, through the evening news, through the late-night talk shows I never usually watched. I kept the lights on later than usual, somehow believing that if I just stayed awake long enough, the calls would come. At midnight, when October 15th officially became October 16th, I finally accepted that my children had forgotten my birthday entirely. I sat in my darkened living room and cried for the first time since Frank's funeral, not just because they had forgotten, but because I realized how completely alone I felt in the world. The next morning, I woke up hoping that maybe they would call with apologies, explanations, belated birthday wishes. But October 16th came and went without a word. So did the 17th and the 18th. A full week passed before Rebecca finally called, not to apologize for missing my birthday, but to ask if I could watch her 10-year-old son Tommy for the weekend, because she had a business conference in Atlanta. When I gently mentioned that she had missed my birthday, she let out this little laugh and said, "Oh, Mom, I'm so sorry. Things have been absolutely crazy at work. You know how it is." As if being busy was a reasonable excuse for forgetting your mother's birthday. I told her I understood, because that's what mothers do. We make excuses for our children's thoughtlessness. We absorb their guilt and disappointment so they don't have to carry it. But that night, after Tommy went to bed, I sat in my kitchen and made a small notation in my journal, a habit I'd kept since Frank died. October 15th, birthday forgotten by all 3 children. I wrote it in blue ink, the same color I used for sad occasions, and I underlined it twice. Michael called 3 days later asking if I could lend him $5,000 for a piece of equipment for his company. During our conversation, I mentioned that he had missed my birthday, and he said, "Aw, Mom, I'm terrible with dates. You know that. Sarah's usually the one who keeps track of that stuff." He didn't apologize, didn't ask how I had spent the day, didn't even seem particularly bothered by the fact that he had forgotten. He just brushed it off like it was a minor inconvenience, like forgetting to water a plant, or missing a dentist appointment. Sarah called a week later, full of excitement about a new boyfriend she was dating, chattering on about restaurants they'd been to and trips they were planning. When I brought up my birthday, she gasped dramatically and said, "Oh my God, Mom, I'm the worst daughter ever. I've been so distracted with David, and work has been insane, and I completely spaced it out. I'll make it up to you, I promise." But she never did. No card arrived in the mail, no flowers were delivered, no makeup dinner was planned. It was as if apologizing for forgetting was the same as actually remembering. That first forgotten birthday cut deep, but I convinced myself it was an anomaly, a perfect storm of busy schedules and adult responsibilities. I made excuses for them in my mind, told myself that they were all dealing with their own lives and challenges. Rebecca was going through a difficult divorce, Michael was struggling to keep his business afloat, and Sarah was navigating the complicated world of dating in her late 30s. Surely next year would be different. But the second forgotten birthday was somehow worse, because it proved that the first wasn't an accident. October 15th came around again, and I found myself in the same position, sitting at the same kitchen table, waiting for phone calls that never came. This time, I didn't make pancakes or check my phone obsessively. I had learned that hope was just another word for disappointment in disguise. I spent the day gardening, pulling weeds from my flower beds with more aggression than necessary, as if I could somehow uproot the growing resentment along with the dandelions. This time, it took 2 weeks before anyone called, and it was only because Rebecca needed me to pick up Tommy from school when his regular sitter canceled. When I mentioned the birthday, she said, "Mom, you can't expect us to remember every single date. We're adults with our own families and responsibilities." The casual dismissal in her voice stung worse than outright cruelty would have. At least cruelty acknowledged that the birthday mattered enough to be deliberately ignored. The third forgotten birthday was when something fundamental shifted inside me. October 15th arrived with the same autumn beauty, the same crisp air and golden leaves, but I felt nothing. No anticipation, no hope, no disappointment. I had reached that particular stage of grief, where numbness replaces pain, where you stop expecting anything because expecting leads to suffering. I didn't wait by the phone or check my messages. I knew there wouldn't be any. Instead, I drove to the cemetery and sat by Frank's grave, telling him about how our children had become strangers wearing familiar faces. I talked to his headstone about the grandchildren who called only when they needed something, about the holidays that had become obligations rather than celebrations, about the slow erosion of family bonds that happens when only one person is doing the work of maintaining them. 3 days after that third forgotten birthday, Sarah called asking if I could help her with a down payment for a new car. Not a word about my birthday, not even a belated acknowledgement. She just launched into her financial problems as if I existed solely to solve them. That's when I realized that to my children, I wasn't Lois Patterson, a woman with feelings and needs and a birthday that mattered. I was just Mom, the eternal resource, the problem solver, the bank account, with unlimited funds and unconditional forgiveness. That night, I sat in Frank's old office and pulled out the will we had written together 15 years earlier. It was a simple document that left everything to our 3 children in equal shares. The house, the savings accounts, the investments, the life insurance policies. Everything we had worked for, everything we had sacrificed to build, was meant to give them security and comfort after we were gone. I read through every page, remembering the conversations Frank and I had about wanting to take care of our children even after death, about leaving them something meaningful to remember us by. But as I sat there in that quiet office, surrounded by photos of birthday parties and Christmas mornings and family vacations, I couldn't help but wonder what exactly they would remember. Would they remember the woman who never missed a birthday, who always showed up for them, who loved them unconditionally? Or would they remember the convenient resource, the woman who was always there when they needed something but never quite important enough to remember when they didn't? The answer became clear to me with startling certainty. They would remember what they had always remembered, that Mom was there when they needed her, reliable and forgettable in equal measure. They would inherit my house and my money and my possessions, but they had already forgotten the woman who had earned them. They would divide up my estate with the same casual efficiency they used to divide up my birthday, which is to say they would take what they wanted and move on without looking back. That's when I knew what I had to do. I couldn't make them remember my birthday, couldn't force them to value the relationship we had built over decades of love and sacrifice. But I could control what happened after I was gone. I could make sure that my final act as their mother reflected the same level of care and attention they had shown me for the past 3 years. I picked up the phone and called Margaret Chen, the estate attorney who had helped Frank and me with our original will. Margaret was a sharp woman in her 50s who had built her practice on helping families navigate the complex emotions that come with inheritance planning. She had seen every variation of family dysfunction and had developed the kind of professional compassion that comes from understanding that money and love rarely follow the same rules. "Mrs. Patterson," she said when I called her office the next morning, "it's been years since we've spoken. How are you holding up?" "I'm well, Margaret," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. "I need to make some changes to my will. Significant changes." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that lawyers use when they're choosing their words carefully. "Of course. Would you like to schedule an appointment to discuss what you have in mind?" "I want to remove my children from my will entirely," I said, the words coming out clearer and more certain than I had expected. "I want to leave everything to charity instead." Another pause, longer this time. "That's certainly your prerogative, Mrs. Patterson, but that's a significant decision. Would you like to discuss the implications before we move forward?" "I've been thinking about it for weeks," I said, which was true. I know exactly what I want to do. We scheduled the appointment for the following Thursday, giving me time to research charities and think through the details. I spent the next few days in a strange state of calm productivity, researching organizations that mattered to me, causes that Frank and I had always supported. I found myself drawn to 3 specific charities: the local animal shelter where I had volunteered after Frank died, the literacy program at the public library where I had read to children for years, and the scholarship fund at the community college where Frank had taught night classes. These organizations had shown me more appreciation for my small contributions than my own children had shown for a lifetime of love. The animal shelter sent thank you notes for my modest donations. The library program coordinator always made sure to tell me how much the children enjoyed my reading sessions. And the scholarship fund sent annual reports showing how donations had helped local students achieve their educational goals. The contrast was stark and painful. Strangers treated my contributions with more respect than my own children treated my existence. Volunteers at the animal shelter remembered my name and asked about my health. Librarians saved special books they thought I would enjoy. And scholarship recipients wrote heartfelt letters about how the fund had changed their lives. Meanwhile, my children called only when they needed something and forgot the most basic fact about me: the day I was born. As Thursday approached, I found myself feeling lighter than I had in years. The decision felt right in a way that surprised me. I had spent so much of my life worried about what my children would think, how they would feel, whether I was being a good mother. But good mothers raise children who remember their birthdays, who value the relationship enough to maintain it, who understand that love is a two-way street that requires effort from both sides.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
I arrived at Margaret's office 15 minutes early, carrying a folder with information about the 3 charities I had chosen. The waiting room was decorated in soothing beiges and soft blues, with abstract paintings that probably cost more than most people's cars. I sat in a leather chair that was more comfortable than anything in my own house and watched other families come and go, wondering if they were struggling with the same kinds of decisions I was facing. When Margaret called me into her office, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced in years. Her office was exactly as I remembered it: floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with legal texts, a massive desk made from some kind of dark wood, and windows that looked out onto the town square, where Frank and I used to take evening walks when we were young. "Mrs. Patterson," Margaret said, settling into her chair across from me. I have to ask this as your attorney. Are you making this decision in response to a specific incident, or is this something you've been considering for a while? I appreciated her directness. 3 years ago, my children forgot my birthday, all 3 of them. The year after that, they forgot it again. This year, they forgot it for the 3rd time. That's not an accident, Margaret. That's a pattern. She nodded slowly, making notes on a legal pad. I understand that must have been hurtful, but disinheritance is a permanent decision. Have you considered other options? Perhaps talking to them about how their behavior has affected you? I've tried, I said, though I realized as I said it that I hadn't really tried. I had mentioned the forgotten birthdays, but I had never explained how deeply they had hurt me, never demanded the respect and attention I deserved. But at my age, I shouldn't have to beg my own children to remember that I exist. Margaret set down her pen and looked at me with the kind of professional kindness that comes from years of helping people navigate difficult family situations. Mrs. Patterson, I've been practicing family law for over 20 years, and I've seen many families struggle with these kinds of issues. Sometimes adult children get so caught up in their own lives that they lose sight of what's important. It doesn't always mean they don't love you. Love is a verb, Margaret, I replied, repeating something Frank used to say. It's not a feeling you have, it's something you do. And for 3 years, my children have done nothing to show me they love me. They've shown me that they remember I exist when they need something, but they can't remember the one day that's supposed to be about me. She made more notes, asking me about my relationship with my children, about their financial situations, about whether any of them had expressed remorse for their behavior. I answered her questions honestly, explaining how each forgotten birthday had felt like a small death, how I had slowly realized that I was mourning the loss of relationships that had perhaps never been as strong as I had believed. I want to be clear about something, I said as our conversation wound down. This isn't about punishing my children. It's about directing my resources toward people and organizations that have shown they value what I have to offer. I've spent 73 years putting my children first, and I want to spend whatever time I have left putting myself first. Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen from her during our entire conversation. Mrs. Patterson, I think that might be the healthiest thing I've heard anyone say in this office in years. We spent the next hour going through the details of the new will. I would leave specific amounts to each of the 3 charities, along with personal letters explaining why I had chosen them. The house would go to the animal shelter, with the understanding that they could sell it and use the proceeds for their programs. My savings and investments would be divided equally among all 3 organizations. My personal belongings would be donated to various local charities, except for a few items that I wanted to give to neighbors and friends who had shown me genuine kindness over the years. What about your children? Margaret asked. Do you want to leave them anything at all? Even a small bequest might help them understand that you still loved them, even if you were disappointed in their behavior. I thought about it for a moment, considering whether I wanted to leave them each $1 as a symbolic gesture, or perhaps something more meaningful. But then I realized that even a token bequest would suggest that they deserved something, that their behavior had been acceptable even if disappointing. I didn't want to send that message. No, I said firmly. I want to leave them exactly what they gave me for my last 3 birthdays, nothing. Margaret nodded and made a note. I'll need to include a clause specifically stating that the omission of your children is intentional, not an oversight. This will help prevent any challenges to the will. Good, I said. I wanted to be absolutely clear that this was my choice, made with full knowledge of what I was doing. As I prepared to leave, Margaret handed me a draft of the new will to review. Take this home and read through it carefully. If you're satisfied with everything, we can schedule another appointment to sign the final version. But Mrs. Patterson, I want you to consider something. Once you sign this will, it will be legally binding. If your children reach out to you, if they apologize and change their behavior, you can always change the will again. But you might want to tell them about the changes you're making. Give them a chance to understand the consequences of their actions. I folded the draft carefully and put it in my purse. Margaret, if my children needed a threat to treat me with basic respect, then they're not the people I thought I raised. I don't want their love under duress. I want their love because I'm worth loving. The drive home gave me time to think about what I had just done. I had essentially fired my children from the job of being my heirs, and I had done it with the same calm efficiency I might use to cancel a subscription or change insurance companies. The lack of emotional turmoil surprised me. I had expected to feel guilt, regret, uncertainty. Instead, I felt relief. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I had taken control of my own life. I had stopped waiting for my children to remember me and started remembering myself. I had stopped hoping they would change and started changing the things I could control. I had stopped being a victim of their neglect and started being the architect of my own dignity. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and read through the draft will. Every word felt right. Every decision felt justified. I was leaving my estate to organizations that had shown me kindness, respect, and appreciation. I was investing in causes that had given me purpose and meaning. I was ensuring that my final act in this world would reflect my values, not my disappointments. But as I sat there in the quiet house, I couldn't help but think about the birthdays that had brought me to this point. 3 October 15ths that had passed unmarked, uncelebrated, unremembered. 3 days that had slowly eroded my faith in the relationships I had thought were unshakable. 3 strikes that had finally taught me that unconditional love doesn't mean unconditional acceptance of disrespect. I thought about Frank and how he would have reacted to our children's behavior. He had been a firm believer in accountability, in the idea that actions have consequences. He would have been disappointed in them, but I think he would have been proud of me for finally standing up for myself. He always said that I was too soft, too willing to make excuses for behavior that shouldn't be excused. You teach people how to treat you, he used to say. If you accept being treated poorly, you're teaching them that poor treatment is acceptable. I had been a poor teacher, apparently. I had accepted forgotten birthdays, casual dismissals, and being taken for granted. I had taught my children that their mother's feelings were optional, that her needs were secondary, that her existence was a given rather than a gift. But it wasn't too late to teach them one final lesson about consequences and accountability. The next morning, I called Margaret's office and scheduled the signing appointment for the following week. I had made my decision, and I was ready to make it official. I spent the days leading up to the appointment organizing my house, going through photo albums and personal papers, trying to imagine how my possessions would find their way to new homes after I was gone. In Frank's office, I found boxes of letters and cards from our children over the years. Birthday cards, Mother's Day cards, thank you notes, Christmas cards. I sat on the floor surrounded by decades of expressions of love and gratitude, wondering when the words had stopped meaning anything. When had "I love you, Mom" become just something to write in a card rather than something to demonstrate through actions? I found myself analyzing the evolution of their messages over the years. The early cards were full of elaborate drawings and misspelled words of genuine affection. The teenage cards were brief but sincere. The adult cards became increasingly generic, purchased rather than made, signed rather than personalized. The most recent cards I could find were from several years ago, suggesting that even the minimal effort of sending a card had become too much trouble. But what struck me most was the absence of recent cards. When had they stopped sending birthday cards entirely? When had they decided that their mother no longer deserved even the most basic acknowledgement of her existence? I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment, but I could see the gradual decline in effort, the slow erosion of connection that had led to 3 forgotten birthdays. I packed the cards away carefully, not because I wanted to keep them, but because I wanted to remember the progression. I wanted to remember that their neglect hadn't happened overnight, that I hadn't been unreasonable to expect more from them. I wanted to remember that I had tried to maintain the relationship long after they had stopped trying. The signing appointment arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt surprisingly ordinary for such a momentous occasion. I dressed carefully in a navy blue suit that Frank had always said made me look distinguished, and I drove to Margaret's office with the same sense of purpose I had felt the week before. Margaret had prepared multiple copies of the will, along with all the necessary legal documents. She explained each section carefully, making sure I understood the implications of what I was signing. She asked me one final time if I was certain about my decision, and I told her I had never been more certain of anything in my life. Mrs. Patterson, she said as I prepared to sign, I want you to know that I think you're making a brave decision. It takes courage to prioritize your own dignity and self-respect, especially when it means disappointing people you love. Thank you, Margaret, I said, picking up the pen. I think Frank would be proud of me for finally standing up for myself. I signed my name with the same careful precision I had used for 73 years of birthday cards, Christmas cards, and thank you notes that my children had stopped sending. Each signature felt like a small act of liberation, a declaration that I was worth more than they had been willing to give me. As I left Margaret's office, I felt lighter than I had in years. The decision was made, the papers were signed, and my future was now in my own hands. I had spent 3 years mourning the loss of relationships that had perhaps never been as strong as I had believed, and now I was ready to invest in relationships that actually valued what I had to offer. That afternoon, I drove to the animal shelter to deliver my monthly donation in person. The staff greeted me warmly, asked about my health, and thanked me for my continued support. I watched volunteers walking dogs and playing with cats, and I thought about how these people showed more genuine care for abandoned animals than my own children had shown for their mother. I visited the library next, where the children's program coordinator thanked me for my regular volunteer work and asked if I would be interested in helping with a special holiday reading program. I said yes, because I realized I had time and energy to invest in relationships that appreciated what I had to offer. Finally, I stopped by the community college where Frank had taught, and I spoke with the scholarship fund coordinator about the impact of donations on local students. She showed me letters from recipients, photos from graduation ceremonies, and statistics about how the program had helped students achieve their educational goals. I felt more pride in that half-hour conversation than I had felt in years of watching my children take my contributions for granted. That evening, I sat in my kitchen and wrote letters to each of the 3 charities, explaining why I had chosen to include them in my will. I told them about Frank's connection to the community college, about my love for animals and my volunteer work at the shelter, about my belief in the importance of literacy and education. I wanted them to understand that my bequest wasn't just about money, but about values and connection and mutual respect. I also wrote letters to my children, though I wasn't sure if I would ever send them. I explained how their forgotten birthdays had made me feel, how their casual dismissal of my feelings had slowly eroded my faith in our relationship. I told them about the new will, about my decision to leave my estate to organizations that had shown me genuine appreciation. I tried to explain that this wasn't about punishment, but about self-respect and dignity. But as I wrote, I realized that I didn't owe them explanations. They had had 3 years to figure out that forgetting their mother's birthday was hurtful and disrespectful. They had had countless opportunities to show me that I mattered to them, that our relationship was worth maintaining. They had chosen not to take those opportunities, and now I was choosing to respond accordingly. I folded the letters and put them in my desk drawer, unsure if I would ever send them. Part of me wanted them to understand why I had made this decision, but another part of me recognized that if they needed an explanation to treat me with basic respect, then they had already proven my point. The months that followed were some of the most peaceful I had experienced since Frank's death. I threw myself into volunteer work, strengthened friendships with neighbors and acquaintances, and began to build a life that didn't revolve around waiting for my children to remember I existed. I started taking art classes at the community center, joined a book club at the library, and began fostering cats from the animal shelter. October 15th approached again, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the familiar dread that had accompanied my birthday. I had made plans to celebrate with my book club friends, women my age, who understood the importance of marking life's milestones. I had ordered a small cake from the bakery downtown and planned a dinner at my favorite restaurant. But 2 days before my birthday, something unexpected happened. My phone rang, and when I answered, I heard Sarah's voice on the other end. "Mom," she said, and I could hear something different in her tone. "I wanted to call early this year. I know I've been terrible about remembering your birthday, and I wanted to make sure I didn't forget again. I'm driving up from Boston on Friday to spend the weekend with you. I thought we could celebrate properly this time." I sat in stunned silence for a moment, unsure how to respond. After 3 years of forgotten birthdays, After months of accepting that my children had chosen not to prioritize our relationship, Sarah was suddenly reaching out. Part of me wanted to be happy, to welcome her with open arms and pretend that the past 3 years hadn't happened. But another part of me recognized that this call was coming awfully late. Where had this sudden interest in my birthday been for the past 3 years? Why was she remembering now, when she had failed to remember for so long? And even if she was sincere, what about Rebecca and Michael? Were they suddenly going to remember too? Or would Sarah's belated attention be the exception rather than the rule? That's very thoughtful of you, Sarah, I said carefully. But I've already made plans with friends. Maybe we can get together the following weekend instead. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Oh, okay. I just thought, I wanted to make up for missing your birthday before. I know I've been a terrible daughter. You haven't been terrible, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. You've been busy with your own life. I understand that. But I should have remembered, she said, and I could hear genuine regret in her voice. Your birthday is important, and I should have made it a priority. I'm sorry, Mom. I really am. I felt a familiar tug of maternal instinct, the urge to reassure her and make her feel better about her choices. But I also felt something new, a protective instinct for my own emotional well-being. I had spent months learning to prioritize my own needs, and I wasn't ready to abandon that progress for the sake of making Sarah feel better about her guilt. I appreciate the apology, I said. But Sarah, this is the 4th year. I can't keep having the same conversation about how busy you are and how sorry you are. Either my birthday matters to you or it doesn't. Either our relationship is worth maintaining, or it isn't. I can't keep being the only one who cares about it. Another pause, longer this time. You're right, she said quietly. I don't have any excuse. I don't know why I let it slip by. It's like I get so caught up in my own problems that I forget there are other people in the world. I'm not other people, Sarah, I said. I'm your mother. I carried you for 9 months, raised you for 18 years, and supported you through every challenge you faced. I deserve better than to be forgotten 3 years in a row. You do, she said. You absolutely do. And I want to do better. I want to be a better daughter. Will you let me try? I thought about the will sitting in Margaret's office, about the letters I had written but never sent, about the peaceful life I had been building without the constant disappointment of unmet expectations. I thought about the book club friends who had remembered my birthday without being asked, about the volunteers at the animal shelter who treated me with genuine warmth and respect. I don't know, Sarah, I said honestly. I've spent the last few months learning to be happy without depending on you and your siblings for validation. I've made friends who remember my birthday without being reminded. I've found volunteer work that makes me feel valued and appreciated. I'm not sure I want to go back to hoping you'll remember to care about me. Mom, that's not fair, she said, and I could hear the frustration creeping into her voice. I'm trying to apologize and make things right. Isn't that what you wanted? 3 years ago, yes, I said. But I've moved beyond wanting apologies. I've moved beyond hoping you'll change. I've learned to invest my time and energy in relationships that don't require me to beg for basic respect. The conversation ended awkwardly, with Sarah promising to call again soon, and me promising to think about whether I wanted her to. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and thought about what had just happened. Sarah had finally remembered my birthday, had finally acknowledged that her behavior had been hurtful, had finally expressed genuine remorse. Wasn't that what I had wanted all along? But I realized that what I had wanted 3 years ago was different from what I needed now. 3 years ago, I had wanted my children to remember my birthday and value our relationship. Now, I wanted relationships that didn't require constant maintenance and explanation. I wanted to be surrounded by people who showed up consistently, not people who apologized for their absence. The next day, Rebecca called, and then Michael. Both of them had suddenly remembered that my birthday was approaching. Both of them wanted to make plans to celebrate. Both of them were full of apologies and promises to do better. I found myself having variations of the same conversation I had had with Sarah, explaining that their sudden attention felt too little, too late. Mom, we're trying to make this right. Rebecca said during her call. Isn't that what matters? We're admitting we were wrong and trying to fix it. Rebecca, if I had to threaten to fire you to get you to show up to work on time, would that make you a good employee? I asked. If I had to explain to a friend why it hurt my feelings when they forgot my birthday, would that make them a good friend? That's not the same thing, she said. Isn't it? I asked. You're calling me now because you finally realized that your behavior was hurting me. But you didn't call me for 3 years when the behavior was actually happening. You didn't care about my feelings until you realized there might be consequences for ignoring them. I realized as I had these conversations that my children had learned to see me as endlessly forgiving, infinitely patient, always available for their convenience. They had learned that they could ignore me for months or years, and then return to my life whenever they needed something, confident that I would welcome them back without question. But I had spent the last year learning to value myself the way I had always valued them, and I was no longer willing to accept relationships that only existed on their terms. I had learned that love without respect is just manipulation, that family obligations without emotional investment are just guilt, that forgiveness without accountability is just enabling poor behavior. As my birthday approached, I found myself feeling something I hadn't felt in years: excitement. Not the anxious excitement of hoping my children would remember, but the genuine excitement of knowing that I was valued by people who chose to value me. My book club friends had planned a surprise celebration, the animal shelter volunteers had organized a small party, and the library staff had invited me to a birthday lunch. For the first time in 4 years, I knew my birthday would be celebrated by people who remembered it because they cared about me, not because they felt obligated to care about me. October 15th arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that makes New England famous, and I woke up feeling genuinely excited for the first time in years. Instead of lying in bed wondering if my phone would ring, I got up early and made myself a proper breakfast: eggs Benedict with fresh chives from my garden, coffee from the good beans I usually saved for special occasions, and orange juice in the crystal glass Frank had given me for our 20th anniversary. I was celebrating myself, and it felt revolutionary. At 10 o'clock sharp, my doorbell rang, and I opened it to find Helen Kowalski from my book club standing on my porch with an enormous bouquet of sunflowers and a smile that could have powered the entire neighborhood. "Happy birthday, Lois!" she exclaimed, pulling me into a hug that smelled like vanilla and happiness. "The girls are all at Rosie's Cafe waiting for you. We've reserved the back room and everything." Helen was 71, a retired high school principal who had moved to Millbrook 3 years ago after her husband died. We had bonded over shared experiences of widowhood and the particular loneliness that comes with adult children who treat their mothers like seasonal acquaintances. She had become the kind of friend I hadn't realized I needed, someone who showed up without being asked, who remembered small details about my life, who treated friendship like a commitment rather than a convenience. The celebration at Rosie's Cafe was everything a birthday party should be. 8 women from our book club had gathered around a table decorated with balloons and homemade cards, and when I walked in, they burst into an enthusiastic rendition of Happy Birthday that made other diners turn around and smile. The cake was chocolate with cream cheese frosting, my favorite, and written across the top in purple icing were the words, "Celebrating Lois, a woman worth knowing." I sat there surrounded by women who had chosen to be there, who had coordinated schedules and planned surprises, and spent their own money to make me feel special, and I felt something I had almost forgotten existed: pure, uncomplicated joy. These women barely knew me compared to my children, yet they had put more effort into celebrating my birthday than my own family had managed in 3 years. Margaret Foster, a retired librarian who always wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, stood up and tapped her water glass with a spoon. "I'd like to say something about our birthday girl," she announced, and the table quieted down. I've known Lois for 2 years now, and in that time she has been the most reliable, thoughtful, generous member of our little group. She never misses a meeting, she always has something insightful to say about whatever we're reading, and she remembers details about all of our lives that sometimes we forget ourselves. The other women nodded in agreement, and Margaret Chen, who ran the local flower shop, added, "Lois brought me soup when I had the flu last month, even though we had only talked a few times. That's the kind of person she is. She pays attention to people. I felt tears pricking at my eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that I was valued, appreciated, seen. These women had noticed things about me that my own children had never bothered to observe. They saw me as a complete person, not just as a role they expected me to play. After lunch, I drove to the animal shelter for my regular volunteer shift, but when I arrived, I found the staff room decorated with streamers and a small cake waiting on the break table. Janet Murphy, the shelter director, greeted me with a grin and said, "We couldn't let your birthday pass without acknowledgement. You've been volunteering here for 4 years, and you've made such a difference in the lives of our animals." I spent the afternoon walking dogs and socializing cats, tasks that had become meditation for me over the past year. There was something deeply satisfying about caring for creatures who appreciated attention without analyzing it, who were grateful for kindness without questioning the motives behind it. The dogs didn't care that I was 73 or widowed or struggling with complicated family relationships. They just cared that I showed up consistently and treated them with gentleness. Around 4 o'clock, as I was sitting in the cat room with a tabby named Morris purring in my lap, my phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it and saw Michael's name on the screen. "Happy birthday, Mom. Sorry I'm calling late. Work has been crazy. Hope you're having a good day." I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling a complicated mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to feel grateful that he had remembered, even if it was hours late, and delivered via text rather than a phone call. But mostly I felt sad for him, for the relationship we could have had if he had put in even a fraction of the effort that my book club friends had shown. I typed back a simple "thank you" and put my phone away. I didn't want to let his minimal effort diminish the joy I had felt all day. I had learned that I could acknowledge his gesture without being grateful for the bare minimum, that I could respond politely without pretending that a text message was equivalent to genuine care. That evening, I hosted a small dinner party for Helen and 3 other close friends I had made since Frank's death. We ate takeout from the Italian restaurant downtown and drank wine from the bottles I had been saving for special occasions, and we talked about everything except family obligations and disappointment. We discussed books and travel plans and local politics and the upcoming election, and I felt intellectually stimulated in a way I hadn't experienced in years. As my friends were leaving around 9 o'clock, Helen pulled me aside and said quietly, "Lois, I hope you know how much your friendship means to all of us. You bring such warmth and wisdom to our group. I hope today felt as special as you are." I hugged her tightly and said, "It was perfect. Absolutely perfect." After everyone left, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and reflected on the day. I had received more genuine affection and attention in one day than I had gotten from my children in 3 years. I had been celebrated, appreciated, and valued by people who had chosen to invest in our relationships. I felt fulfilled in a way that had nothing to do with guilt or obligation or family duty. My phone rang around 10:30, and I saw Sarah's name on the caller ID. For a moment I considered not answering, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hi, Mom," she said, and her voice sounded smaller than usual. "I wanted to call and wish you a happy birthday. I know I said I was going to drive up this weekend, but David surprised me with tickets to a concert, and I should have called earlier today. I'm sorry." I felt that familiar disappointment settling in my chest, but it was muted somehow, buffered by the genuine joy I had experienced throughout the day. "Thank you for calling, Sarah," I said neutrally. "Did you do anything special today?" she asked, and I could hear the guilt in her voice. "I had a lovely day," I said. "My book club friends threw me a party at lunch. The animal shelter staff surprised me with cake, and I had dinner with friends. It was exactly what I wanted." There was a pause on her end. "That sounds really nice, Mom. I'm glad you had a good birthday." "I did," I said. "I really did." After we hung up, I realized that Sarah's call hadn't ruined my mood the way I might have expected. Her absence from my day had been noted but not mourned, because my day had been full of people who chose to be present. I had learned to build a life that didn't depend on other people's failures or successes, and that independence felt like the best birthday gift I could have given myself. The next few weeks passed peacefully. Rebecca called the following Sunday with elaborate apologies and promises to visit soon. Michael sent a belated birthday card with a generic message about hoping I was well. Sarah texted periodically with updates about her life and questions about recipes or household repairs. They were all trying harder, but their efforts felt performative somehow, like they were checking boxes rather than genuinely investing in our relationships. Meanwhile, my life continued to expand in unexpected directions. I joined a senior hiking group that met twice a week for walks through the state park. I started taking pottery classes at the community center and discovered I had a talent for throwing bowls. I began fostering senior cats from the animal shelter, giving them comfortable final homes when adopters preferred younger animals. Each new activity brought new friendships, and each friendship reinforced the lesson I had been learning all year. Relationships should be mutual, consistent, and based on genuine care rather than duty or convenience. The people I met through my volunteer work and hobbies showed up because they wanted to, not because they felt obligated to. They remembered details about my life because they found me interesting, not because remembering was a familial requirement. In November, I received an unexpected phone call from Margaret Chen. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, "I wanted to check in with you about the will we drafted. Sometimes people have second thoughts after major family decisions, and I wanted to make sure you're still comfortable with the changes we made." I thought about the question seriously before answering. Had my children's recent attempts at reconciliation changed my feelings about the will? Had their belated birthday wishes and awkward apologies made me reconsider my decision to exclude them from my estate? "I'm still comfortable with the decision," I told her. "If anything, the past few weeks have reinforced my belief that I made the right choice. My children are trying harder now, but only because they've realized their behavior was unacceptable. They're not trying because they genuinely value our relationship." "I understand," Margaret said, "but I want to make sure you're not acting out of anger or hurt. Estate planning should be based on your values and priorities, not on punishing people for their behavior." "It's not about punishment," I said, though I had to think carefully about whether that was true. "It's about alignment. I want my estate to go to people and organizations that share my values, that have shown they appreciate what I have to offer. My children have shown me that they don't value our relationship enough to maintain it without constant reminders. Why would I assume they would value my estate more than they value me?" Margaret made some notes and then said, "Have you considered the possibility that your children might change? That they might learn from this experience and become more attentive family members?" "They might," I agreed. "But Margaret, I'm 73 years old. I don't have unlimited time to wait for people to grow up and start treating me with respect. I've spent 4 years hoping they would change, and the only change I've seen is increased effort after they realized there might be consequences. That's not genuine growth, that's damage control." "That's a fair point," she said. "And Mrs. Patterson, I want you to know that I think you've handled this situation with remarkable grace. A lot of people in your position would have cut off contact entirely or created family drama. You've simply redirected your resources toward people who appreciate them." After we hung up, I realized that Margaret had helped me articulate something I had been feeling but hadn't quite been able to express. This wasn't about punishing my children or getting revenge for their neglect. It was about honoring my own values and investing in relationships that reflected those values. I valued consistency, thoughtfulness, and mutual respect. My children had shown me they didn't share those values, at least not when it came to our relationship. The holidays approached with the usual mix of anticipation and dread that comes with complicated family dynamics. In previous years, I had hosted Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners, spending weeks planning menus and decorating the house, and making sure everyone's dietary preferences were accommodated. The holidays had become elaborate productions designed to create the illusion of family closeness, even when the closeness didn't exist outside of those forced gatherings. This year, I decided to do something different. When Rebecca called in early November to ask about Thanksgiving plans, I told her I had already made arrangements to volunteer at the community center's holiday dinner for seniors who had nowhere else to go. "But Mom," she said, sounding genuinely shocked, "we always have Thanksgiving at your house. It's tradition." "It was tradition," I corrected. "But traditions require participation from everyone involved. I've been doing all the work and all the hosting, while you three show up for a few hours and then leave. I've decided to spend my holidays with people who actually want to be with me. That's not fair, she said. We want to be with you. That's why we come for Thanksgiving. Rebecca, when was the last time any of you helped with meal preparation? When was the last time anyone stayed to help with cleanup? When was the last time anyone asked what I wanted to do for the holidays instead of just assuming I would host? I asked. She was quiet for a moment. We assumed you liked hosting. You never said you didn't want to. I liked hosting when it felt like a celebration of our family, I said. But it hasn't felt like that in years. It's felt like an obligation that I fulfill while everyone else enjoys the benefits. I'm too old to keep cooking for people who don't appreciate the effort. The conversation ended with Rebecca promising to call me back after she talked to Michael and Sarah, and I suspected they were trying to figure out how to salvage their holiday plans without having to take responsibility for hosting. The thought amused me more than it hurt me, because I realized I no longer cared about their inconvenience. They had taken my labor for granted for years, and now they would have to figure out their own arrangements. On Thanksgiving morning, I woke up early and drove to the community center to help prepare dinner for 60 seniors who would otherwise spend the holiday alone. The kitchen was bustling with volunteers, many of whom I recognized from my various activities around town. We peeled potatoes and carved turkeys and arranged flowers on tables, and the atmosphere was full of genuine warmth and camaraderie. As we worked, I found myself talking with other volunteers about their families, their lives, their reasons for spending Thanksgiving in service to others. Many of them had similar stories of family relationships that had become more obligation than joy, of adult children who took their parents for granted, of holidays that had lost their meaning somewhere along the way. I used to kill myself making perfect holiday meals for my kids, said Barbara Walsh, a woman about my age who was arranging rolls in baskets. Every year I would cook for days, clean the house from top to bottom, set the table with my good china. And every year they would show up late, complain about something, eat quickly, and leave early to visit their in-laws. Last year I realized I was working harder to maintain our relationship than they were. What did you do about it? I asked. Same thing you did, she said with a smile. I stopped doing all the work and started doing what made me happy instead. This is my 3rd year volunteering here, and it's been the best 3 Thanksgivings I've had in decades. The dinner service was beautiful, in a way that my family gatherings had never been. The seniors who came to eat were genuinely grateful for the meal and the company. They thanked the volunteers repeatedly, they engaged in conversations with strangers, they helped clear tables and wash dishes without being asked. The gratitude was authentic, and the community was real, and I felt more thankful that day than I had in years. My phone buzzed periodically with text messages from my children. Rebecca sent a photo of the restaurant where she had ended up taking her family for Thanksgiving dinner, along with a message about how much they missed my cooking. Michael sent a brief, "Happy Thanksgiving, Mom. Hope you're having a good day." Sarah called while I was helping serve dessert, but I let it go to voicemail and listened to her message later. "Hi, Mom," she had said. "I just wanted to say Happy Thanksgiving and tell you that we're thinking about you today. I know you're volunteering at the community center, and I think that's really wonderful. I hope you know how proud we are of you for all the good work you do. Love you." The message was sweet, but it also illustrated exactly why I had made the choices I had made. Sarah was proud of me for volunteering, but she had never shown interest in joining me in that work. She thought it was wonderful that I was serving others, but she had never offered to help me serve our own family in a more meaningful way. She loved me in the abstract, but she didn't love me enough to consistently show up in my life. As December approached, I realized I needed to make a decision about Christmas. My children would expect me to host again, to provide the familiar backdrop for their holiday memories, while they continued to treat me like a supporting character in their own stories. But I had learned too much about my own worth to go back to playing that role. I called each of them in early December and explained that I would be spending Christmas at Helen's house this year. Helen had invited me to join her extended family celebration, and I had accepted because I wanted to spend the holiday with people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. The reactions were predictably dramatic. Rebecca accused me of trying to hurt the family and destroy their children's Christmas memories. Michael seemed more confused than upset, asking repeatedly if I was angry about something specific. Sarah tried to negotiate, offering to help with cooking and cleanup if I would reconsider. But I had made my decision, and it wasn't based on anger or spite. It was based on the simple recognition that I deserved to spend my holidays feeling appreciated rather than taken for granted. I deserved to be surrounded by people who chose to include me rather than people who expected me to serve them. Christmas at Helen's house was a revelation. Her family was large and boisterous and genuinely affectionate with each other. Children played games with their grandparents. Adults helped with meal preparation and cleanup. And everyone seemed genuinely happy to be together. There were disagreements and minor dramas, but they were handled with humor and affection, rather than passive aggression and resentment. Helen's daughter-in-law, Maria, spent an hour showing me photos from their recent vacation and asking about my pottery classes. Her grandson, a college student named David, engaged me in a fascinating conversation about environmental policy and asked thoughtful questions about my experiences with local conservation efforts. Helen's son, Mark, insisted on driving me home after dinner and thanked me repeatedly for being such a good friend to his mother. I felt included in a way I hadn't experienced with my own family in years. These people barely knew me, yet they treated me with more warmth and respect than my own children had shown me in recent memory. They asked about my interests, included me in conversations, and made sure I felt welcome and valued. On the drive home, I reflected on the contrast between this Christmas and the ones I had spent with my own family. At Helen's house, everyone contributed to the celebration, and everyone benefited from it. At my own family gatherings, I had done most of the work, while everyone else enjoyed the results. The difference wasn't just about the amount of effort involved. It was about the spirit of reciprocity and mutual care that made one gathering feel like a celebration and the other feel like a performance. My phone had been buzzing all day with messages from my children, but I had kept it on silent and hadn't checked it until I got home. There were photos of their Christmas celebrations, brief videos of grandchildren opening presents, and messages about how much they missed me and hoped I was having a good day. I responded to each message politely but briefly, thanking them for thinking of me and telling them I had enjoyed a lovely Christmas with friends. I didn't elaborate on how wonderful the day had been, or how much better I felt when I was around people who valued my presence. I simply acknowledged their messages and moved on. The new year arrived with a sense of possibility I hadn't felt in decades. I had successfully restructured my holidays around relationships that nourished me, rather than drained me. I had built a social network of people who shared my interests and values. I had learned to prioritize my own emotional well-being without feeling guilty about disappointing others. In January, I received another call from Margaret Chen, asking if I wanted to review or update my will. I told her I was more convinced than ever that I had made the right decision. The past few months had shown me what healthy relationships looked like, and they looked nothing like the dynamics I had with my children. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, "I have to ask this question for legal purposes. Have any of your children expressed concerns about your mental capacity or suggested that you might not be competent to make estate planning decisions?" The question surprised me. No, why would they? Sometimes, when family members are excluded from wills, they challenge the document by claiming the testator was mentally incompetent or unduly influenced by others. I want to make sure we have documentation of your mental state and decision-making process in case such challenges arise. I felt a chill run down my spine. Do you think my children would challenge the will? I don't know your children, Margaret said carefully. But in my experience, people who feel entitled to an inheritance sometimes become very creative in their efforts to claim it. If they don't know about the changes you've made, they might be shocked when the will is read, and shock sometimes leads to poor decisions. What would you recommend? I asked. I think you should consider telling them about the will changes while you're still alive, she said. That way, if they want to challenge your decision or your mental capacity, they can do it while you're here to defend yourself. It also gives them an opportunity to understand your reasoning and potentially change their behavior if they choose to. The idea of telling my children about the will filled me with anxiety, but I could see the wisdom in Margaret's suggestion. If I died without them knowing about the changes, they would be shocked and hurt, and potentially angry enough to cause legal problems for the charities I wanted to benefit. If I told them while I was alive, I could explain my reasoning and give them a chance to process the information with my guidance. How would you suggest I approach that conversation? I asked. Carefully, Margaret said. I'd recommend doing it in writing first, so you can choose your words precisely and give them time to process the information before any face-to-face conversations. You might also want to consider doing it with a counselor or mediator present, someone who can help facilitate productive discussion rather than emotional reactions. I spent the next few weeks thinking about how to approach the conversation with my children. I knew it would be difficult and potentially painful for everyone involved, but I also knew it was necessary. They deserved to know that their behavior had consequences, and I deserved to have my decisions understood and respected. In February, I decided to write letters to each of my children, explaining the changes I had made to my will and the reasons behind those changes. I spent days crafting the letters, trying to strike the right tone between honest and kind, between firm and loving. I wanted them to understand that this wasn't about punishment or revenge, but about self-respect and alignment with my values. The letter to Rebecca read, Dear Rebecca, I am writing to inform you that I have made significant changes to my estate planning. After careful consideration, I have decided to leave my entire estate to charitable organizations that have shown consistent appreciation for my contributions. This decision is not made in anger, but rather in recognition that my values and priorities have evolved over the past few years. I have learned that I want my final gifts to go to people and organizations that have demonstrated genuine care for me and my contributions. I hope you can understand and respect this decision, even if you don't agree with it. Love, Mom. I wrote similar letters to Michael and Sarah, personalizing each one slightly but maintaining the same basic message. I wasn't asking for their approval or their understanding, but I was giving them the courtesy of advance notice and honest explanation. I mailed the letters on a Tuesday and spent the rest of the week in a state of nervous anticipation. I knew the responses would come quickly and would likely be emotional, and I tried to prepare myself for anger, hurt, and accusations. But I also felt a sense of relief at finally being honest about my feelings and my decisions. The first response came from Sarah, who called on Friday evening in tears. Mom, I just got your letter, and I don't understand. Are you really going to cut us out of your will completely? After everything we've been through as a family? Sarah, this isn't about cutting you out, I said calmly. It's about directing my resources toward people and organizations that have shown they value what I have to offer. You and your siblings have shown me that our relationship isn't a priority for you, so I've decided to prioritize relationships that are mutual and respectful. But we're your children, she said, as if that fact alone should guarantee her an inheritance regardless of how she treated me. Yes, you are, I said, and I raised you to be independent, capable adults who don't need to depend on your mother's money to live comfortable lives. I also raised you to treat people with kindness and respect, but that lesson seems to have been forgotten somewhere along the way. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Sarah alternating between tears and anger and promises to do better, but I had heard those promises before, after each forgotten birthday, and I had learned that promises made under duress rarely translate into lasting change. Rebecca called the next morning, and her approach was more aggressive. Mom, I think you need to see a doctor, she said without preamble. This decision doesn't make sense for someone in their right mind. You're going to leave everything to strangers instead of your own family? That's not normal. Rebecca, there's nothing wrong with my mental capacity, I said firmly. I've made this decision after months of careful consideration, with the guidance of a competent attorney. The decision makes perfect sense when you consider how I've been treated by my family over the past few years. You're being dramatic, she said. So we forgot a few birthdays. That doesn't mean we don't love you. It means you don't respect me, I replied. And respect is a component of love. If you love someone but don't respect them enough to remember their birthday or maintain a relationship with them, then what exactly does that love mean? Michael's response was the most measured of the three, but also the most disappointing. He didn't call. He sent a brief email saying he was sorry I felt that way and hoped I would reconsider. The impersonal nature of his response reinforced everything I had come to understand about our relationship. Even when faced with the news that he had been removed from my will, he couldn't be bothered to pick up the phone and have a real conversation. Over the following weeks, each of my children made various attempts to change my mind. Rebecca sent flowers with apologetic cards. Sarah started calling more frequently, asking about my health and my activities with what felt like forced enthusiasm. Michael even sent a handwritten note acknowledging that he had been a neglectful son and promising to do better. But their efforts felt calculated rather than genuine, motivated by self-interest rather than authentic care. They were responding to the threat of financial loss, not to the recognition that they had hurt their mother. If I rewarded this behavior by changing my will back, I would be teaching them that they only needed to pay attention to me when there was money at stake. In March, Rebecca suggested that we all meet with a family counselor to discuss our communication problems. I agreed, partly because I thought it might help them understand my perspective, and partly because I was curious to see how they would frame the situation to a neutral third party. The counseling session was held in a comfortable office downtown, with Dr. Patricia Vance, a family therapist who specialized in adult-family relationships. Dr. Vance began by asking each of us to describe our perspective on the family dynamics that had led to this situation. Rebecca went first, painting a picture of a busy family with competing obligations, and suggesting that I was being overly sensitive about missed birthdays and infrequent contact. "We all love Mom very much," she said, "but we have our own families and careers to manage. We thought she understood that we care about her even if we don't always show it in the ways she expects." Michael echoed similar themes, emphasizing how much he appreciated everything I had done for the family, and insisting that his love for me was unquestionable, even if his communication skills needed improvement. "I'm not good at remembering dates and making phone calls," he said, "but that doesn't mean I don't care." Sarah took a more emotional approach, tearfully acknowledging that she had been a neglectful daughter and promising to do better. "I know I've hurt Mom's feelings," she said, "and I want to make it right. I want us to be close again." When it was my turn to speak, I chose my words carefully. "I appreciate that my children love me," I said, "but love without consistent action becomes meaningless over time." I spent years making excuses for their behavior, telling myself that they were busy or distracted or going through difficult periods. But, at some point, I realized that I was doing all the emotional labor in our relationships. I was always the one calling, always the one remembering important dates, always the one making an effort to stay connected. Dr. Vance asked thoughtful questions about our family history, our communication patterns, and our expectations of each other. She helped my children understand that their busy lives didn't excuse their neglect, and she helped me articulate why their recent efforts felt insufficient to repair the damage that had been done. "Lois," she said toward the end of the session, "it sounds like you've reached a point where you need to see consistent behavioral change rather than promises of improvement. Is that accurate?" "Yes," I said. "I'm 73 years old. I don't have time to wait for people to grow up and start treating me with basic respect. If my children want to be part of my life, they need to show me that through their actions, not their words." Dr. Vance turned to my children. "And how do you feel about that expectation?" Rebecca shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "It feels like we're being tested. Like Mom is setting up hoops for us to jump through to prove we love her." "Is expecting consistent communication and basic respect really jumping through hoops?" I asked. "Is remembering your mother's birthday really an unreasonable demand?" The session ended with Dr. Vance recommending individual therapy for each of my children to help them understand their own patterns of behavior and relationship management. She also recommended continued family sessions if everyone was willing to commit to honest self-reflection and behavioral change. My children agreed to the therapy recommendations, and I told them I would be willing to participate in future family sessions if I saw genuine evidence of change in their behavior. But I also made it clear that my will would remain unchanged, unless and until they demonstrated sustained improvement in how they treated me. As spring arrived, I settled into a routine that felt sustainable and fulfilling. I continued my volunteer work, maintained my friendships, and pursued hobbies that brought me joy. My children called more frequently, but their efforts still felt somewhat forced, like items on a to-do list rather than genuine expressions of care. I began to understand that the will had become a symbol of something much larger than money or inheritance. It represented my refusal to accept relationships that were one-sided, my insistence that love be demonstrated through actions rather than words, and my commitment to spending my remaining years surrounded by people who genuinely valued my presence in their lives. Whether my children would ever truly understand this lesson remained to be seen. But I had finally learned to value myself enough to set boundaries, to expect respect, and to invest my time and resources in relationships that nourished rather than depleted me. And that felt like the most important inheritance I could leave myself. Summer arrived in Millbrook with the kind of oppressive heat that makes even the most dedicated gardeners retreat indoors by noon. But I found myself energized in ways I hadn't experienced in years. My morning routine had expanded to include a brisk walk through the neighborhood before the temperature climbed, followed by coffee on my back porch where I could watch the birds at the feeders Frank had installed years ago. The cardinals and blue jays had become reliable companions, more consistent in their daily visits than my own children had ever been. I was deadheading roses on a particularly sweltering Tuesday morning when I noticed a moving truck parked in front of the Henderson house next door. The Hendersons had moved to Florida 6 months ago, and the house had been empty ever since, its windows dark and lawn gradually surrendering to weeds, despite the efforts of a sporadic landscaping service. I watched with curiosity as movers unloaded furniture and boxes, wondering what kind of neighbors would replace the quiet elderly couple who had lived there for 30 years. By afternoon, a woman about my age emerged from the house, surveying her new domain with hands on her hips and a look of determined exhaustion. She had short silver hair that caught the light like spun metal and wore gardening clothes that suggested she knew her way around flower beds. When she noticed me watering my tomatoes, she walked over to the low fence that separated our properties. "I'm Gloria Hartman," she said, extending a dirt-streaked hand over the fence. "I promise I'm not usually this disheveled, but moving day has a way of reducing even the most organized person to a sweating mess." "Lois Patterson," I replied, shaking her hand and noting the firm grip that spoke of someone who didn't shy away from physical work. "Welcome to Maple Street. If you need anything while you're getting settled, please don't hesitate to ask." Gloria smiled, and I could see the kind of warmth in her eyes that suggested she might become the kind of neighbor who actually borrows cups of sugar and remembers to return them. "Thank you. I have to admit, I'm a little nervous about starting over at 70. My husband died 2 years ago, and I finally decided the house in Hartford was too big and too full of memories." I felt an immediate kinship with this woman, who had also chosen to rebuild her life after loss, who understood the particular courage required to start fresh in the later decades of life. "I lost my husband 8 years ago," I said. "The adjustment is difficult, but there's something liberating about having complete control over your own decisions for the first time in decades." We talked for nearly an hour, standing on opposite sides of the fence like characters in a Robert Frost poem, sharing the abbreviated life stories that new neighbors exchange. Gloria had been a high school English teacher, had 2 adult sons who lived on the West Coast, and had chosen Millbrook because it was small enough to feel like a community, but large enough to offer cultural opportunities. She had sold her large colonial in Hartford and downsized to the Henderson house because she wanted to simplify her life and reduce the burden of home maintenance. "I'm hoping to find some volunteer opportunities," she said, as our conversation wound down. "I'd like to stay busy and meet people, but I don't want to commit to anything too demanding while I'm still adjusting to a new place." "You should consider the animal shelter," I suggested. "They're always looking for volunteers, and the time commitment is flexible. I've been volunteering there for 4 years, and it's been one of the most rewarding experiences of my widowhood." Gloria's face lit up. "I love animals. I had to leave my cat with my son when I moved because his apartment building doesn't allow pets, and I've been missing having a furry companion." I told her about the foster program at the shelter, how volunteers could provide temporary homes for animals who needed extra care or socialization before being adopted. The idea clearly appealed to her, and by the time we said goodbye, she had asked for directions to the shelter and my phone number, in case she had questions about getting involved. That evening, I called Helen to tell her about my new neighbor, and Helen immediately invited Gloria to join our book club. "We can always use fresh perspectives," she said. "And if she was an English teacher, she'll probably have wonderful insights into whatever we're reading." The next morning, I knocked on Gloria's door with a plate of blueberry muffins and an invitation to coffee. Her house was in various stages of unpacking, with boxes labeled in neat handwriting and furniture arranged in temporary configurations, but she had already managed to create a cozy breakfast nook where we could sit and talk. "I took your advice about the animal shelter," she said as she poured coffee from a pot that smelled like it had been brewing since dawn. "I called yesterday afternoon and spoke with the director. She's going to give me a tour this morning and explain the volunteer opportunities." I felt a small thrill of satisfaction at having connected Gloria with something that might bring her joy. It occurred to me that this was how healthy relationships worked. People looked out for each other, shared information and opportunities, and took genuine pleasure in each other's happiness. The contrast with my family dynamics was stark and painful. As if reading my thoughts, Gloria asked gently, "Do you have family in the area? Children or grandchildren who visit?" I found myself telling her about my 3 children, about the forgotten birthdays and the changed will, about the painful realization that I had been investing more in our relationships than they had been willing to reciprocate. Gloria listened without judgment, asking thoughtful questions and nodding with the kind of understanding that comes from personal experience. "My sons call every few weeks," she said when I finished. "They're good boys, but they're busy with their own lives on the other side of the country. I've learned not to take it personally when I don't hear from them for a while, but I also don't expect them to be my primary source of emotional support. I think that's healthier for everyone involved." Her perspective was refreshing and mature in a way that made me question whether I had been unreasonable in my expectations of my children. But then I remembered that Gloria's sons called every few weeks, while mine had gone months without contact before the will revelation. There was a difference between accepting that adult children have busy lives and accepting that they can completely ignore their mother's existence. Over the following weeks, Gloria and I developed the kind of easy friendship that sometimes emerges between people who are in similar life stages and share compatible values. She joined the book club and immediately became a valued member, bringing insights from her teaching background and a dry sense of humor that kept our discussions lively. She started volunteering at the animal shelter and quickly became indispensable, using her organizational skills to streamline their record-keeping system. We fell into a routine of morning walks together, during which we discussed everything from local politics to gardening techniques to the books we were reading. Gloria had a way of asking questions that made me think more deeply about my own experiences and decisions, and I found myself articulating thoughts and feelings that I had never quite put into words before. "I've been thinking about what you said about teaching people how to treat you," she said one morning as we paused to rest on a bench in the town square. "I think there's wisdom in that, but I also think sometimes we have to accept that some people are incapable of learning the lessons we're trying to teach." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Well, your children might genuinely love you, but simply lack the emotional intelligence to understand how their behavior affects you. Some people are naturally good at maintaining relationships, and others struggle with it despite their best intentions. The question is whether you can accept the love they're capable of giving, even if it doesn't meet your expectations." I considered her words carefully. "But Gloria, if someone loves you, shouldn't they be willing to learn how to show that love in ways that matter to you? Shouldn't they care enough to remember your birthday or call regularly?" "In an ideal world, yes," she said. "But we don't live in an ideal world. We live in a world where people have different strengths and weaknesses, different ways of expressing care, different levels of emotional awareness. The challenge is figuring out whether someone's limitations are forgivable, or whether they cross a line that makes the relationship unsustainable." Her perspective forced me to examine my own motivations and expectations more honestly. Was I being unreasonable in expecting my children to remember my birthday? Was I punishing them for having different communication styles than I preferred? Or was I simply refusing to accept treatment that fell below the standard of basic respect? The question became more pressing in July when Sarah called to invite me to her birthday party. She was turning 39 and had decided to celebrate with a backyard barbecue at her house in Boston. "I know it's short notice," she said, "but I really want you to be there, Mom. It would mean so much to me." The irony of the invitation wasn't lost on me. Sarah wanted me to travel 2 hours to celebrate her birthday, but she couldn't manage to remember mine even when it required nothing more than a phone call. The double standard was breathtaking in its audacity, but I found myself considering whether to accept the invitation anyway. That sounds lovely, Sarah, I said carefully, but I have to ask, do you see the irony in inviting me to your birthday party when you forgot mine for 3 consecutive years? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Mom, I thought we were past that. I've been trying to be a better daughter. I've been calling more often and asking about your life. You have been calling more often, I agreed, but only since you found out about the will. Your increased attention feels motivated by self-interest rather than genuine care. That's not fair, she said, and I could hear the frustration in her voice. Maybe the will was a wake-up call, but that doesn't mean my efforts now aren't genuine. Can't you give me credit for trying to improve? I can give you credit for trying, I said, but I can't pretend that a few months of effort erases years of neglect. Trust has to be rebuilt over time, through consistent actions, not grand gestures. The conversation ended with Sarah promising to think about what I had said and me promising to consider attending her party. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen and tried to sort through my conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to support Sarah's efforts to improve our relationship, even if those efforts were prompted by the changed will. But another part of me resented being expected to celebrate her while she continued to minimize the pain her neglect had caused me. I called Gloria and asked if she wanted to take a walk while I talked through my dilemma. We headed toward the state park, where the trails were shaded and the temperature was more bearable than on the exposed streets of town. It sounds like you're struggling with whether to reward her efforts or maintain your boundaries, Gloria said as we walked along a path bordered by wild ferns and mountain laurel. Exactly, I said. If I go to her party, am I showing her that her recent efforts are appreciated? Or am I teaching her that she can ignore me for years and then expect me to show up when it's convenient for her? Maybe the question isn't about what you're teaching her, Gloria suggested. Maybe the question is what feels right for you. Do you want to go to the party? Do you think you would enjoy it? Or would you spend the whole time feeling resentful? I thought about the question honestly. I would probably enjoy seeing Sarah and meeting her friends, but I would also feel angry about the double standard. I would keep thinking about how she expects me to prioritize her birthday when she couldn't be bothered to remember mine. Then maybe that's your answer, Gloria said. If attending would make you feel worse rather than better, then it's probably not the right choice for you right now. I decided not to attend Sarah's party, but I sent a thoughtful gift and a card explaining that I needed more time to rebuild trust in our relationship. Sarah's response was predictably emotional, but I stood firm in my decision. I had learned that saying no to things that made me feel resentful was an act of self-care, not selfishness. The rest of the summer passed peacefully. Gloria and I took day trips to nearby towns, exploring antique shops and farmers markets and small museums. We attended outdoor concerts in the park and volunteered together at various community events. I fostered 3 senior cats from the animal shelter, giving them comfortable final homes and experiencing the particular joy that comes from easing suffering in the world. My children continued their pattern of increased but inconsistent contact. Rebecca called every few weeks, usually when she needed advice about something or wanted to share news about her divorce proceedings. Michael sent occasional emails with photos of his latest construction projects and updates about his business. Sarah called more frequently, but our conversations often felt forced, as if she was checking items off a list rather than genuinely wanting to connect. In August, I received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Vance, the family therapist we had seen in the spring. Mrs. Patterson, she said, I'm calling because Rebecca contacted me about scheduling another family session. She says the family has been working on communication and would like to discuss the possibility of rebuilding trust. Would you be interested in participating? I was surprised that Rebecca had taken the initiative to schedule another session, but I was also skeptical about their motives. Have they been participating in individual therapy as you recommended? I asked. Rebecca and Sarah have been seeing therapists regularly, Dr. Vance said. Michael has been less consistent, but he has attended several sessions. They seem genuinely committed to understanding their patterns and making changes. I agreed to attend another family session, partly out of curiosity about what they had learned in therapy, and partly because I wanted to give them a fair opportunity to demonstrate growth. We scheduled the meeting for early September. giving everyone time to prepare for what would likely be a difficult conversation. In the weeks leading up to the session, I found myself feeling anxious and hopeful in equal measure. I wanted to believe that my children had genuinely learned from this experience, that they had developed greater empathy and self-awareness through therapy. But I had been disappointed by their promises before, and I was reluctant to get my hopes up, only to be let down again. Gloria proved to be an invaluable sounding board during this period, helping me articulate my expectations for the session and prepare for various possible outcomes. "Remember," she said during one of our walks, "you can acknowledge their efforts without immediately changing your will. Growth takes time, and you deserve to see sustained behavioral change before you make any major decisions." The family therapy session was held on a crisp September morning that reminded me of the autumn days when my children were young and full of potential. Dr. Vance began by asking each of us to share what we had learned since our last meeting and what we hoped to accomplish in this session. Rebecca went first, and I was struck by how different she sounded compared to our previous meeting. "I've learned that I've been taking Mom for granted for years," she said. "I assumed she would always be there, always be available, always forgive me for my neglect. I didn't realize how much emotional labor she was doing to maintain our relationship, while I did almost nothing." Michael spoke next, admitting that he had never really thought about the impact of his poor communication skills on other people. "I always figured that people who cared about me would understand that I'm not good at staying in touch," he said. "But I'm starting to realize that caring about someone means making an effort to show them that care, even if it doesn't come naturally to you." Sarah's contribution was the most emotional, as she tearfully acknowledged the pain her behavior had caused. "I keep thinking about how alone Mom must have felt on her birthdays, waiting for calls that never came," she said. "I can't imagine how hurt and disappointed she must have been, and I'm ashamed that I was so self-absorbed that I didn't notice." When it was my turn to speak, I acknowledged their apparent growth, while also expressing my need to see sustained change over time. "I'm encouraged by what I'm hearing from each of you," I said. "But I've heard apologies and promises before, and they weren't followed by lasting behavioral change. I need to see consistency over months, not just weeks, before I can trust that these insights will translate into different actions." Dr. Vance facilitated a discussion about what specific behavioral changes would help rebuild trust. We talked about regular communication, remembering important dates, and sharing emotional labor in family relationships. My children made specific commitments. Rebecca would call every Sunday, Michael would send weekly emails, and Sarah would keep a calendar with family birthdays and important dates. "I want to be clear about something," I said toward the end of the session. "These changes need to happen because you value our relationship, not because you want to be reinstated in my will. If you're only making an effort because you're worried about your inheritance, then you're missing the point entirely." Rebecca nodded emphatically. "I understand that, Mom. I want to have a real relationship with you, not just a transactional one, based on what I might inherit." The session ended with everyone agreeing to reconvene in 3 months to assess progress. I left feeling cautiously optimistic but also emotionally drained. The conversation had been more productive than I had expected, but I remained skeptical about whether my children could sustain their newfound commitment to better communication. Over the following weeks, I was surprised by their consistency. Rebecca did call every Sunday, sharing details about her life and asking thoughtful questions about mine. Michael sent weekly emails that went beyond basic updates to include observations about his daily life and expressions of interest in my activities. Sarah not only remembered to call regularly, but also sent thoughtful texts about things she thought I would find interesting. The increased contact was pleasant, but also felt somewhat artificial, like they were following a script rather than communicating organically. I found myself analyzing every interaction, looking for signs of genuine change versus performative behavior designed to manipulate me into changing my will. "You seem conflicted about their efforts," Gloria observed one morning as we walked through the town cemetery, a route we had adopted because it was peaceful, and the old headstones provided interesting conversation topics. "I am conflicted," I admitted. "On one hand, I'm getting the kind of attention from them that I've wanted for years. On the other hand, it took the threat of financial consequences to motivate this attention, which makes me question its authenticity. Does the motivation matter if the outcome is positive? Gloria asked. If they start calling regularly and remembering your birthday, does it matter whether they're doing it out of love or out of concern about their inheritance? I thought about her question as we paused to read the inscription on a particularly ornate Victorian monument. I think it does matter, I said finally. If they're only treating me well because they want something from me, then they'll probably revert to their old behavior once they get what they want. But if they're treating me well because they've genuinely learned to value our relationship, then the change is more likely to be permanent. So how will you know which it is? Gloria asked. Time, I said. If they can maintain this level of attention for a year or more without any promise that it will affect their inheritance, then I might believe the change is genuine. My children's consistency continued through October, and for the first time in 4 years, my birthday was not only remembered but celebrated. Rebecca sent flowers and called to sing happy birthday over the phone. Michael drove up from Denver to take me to dinner at my favorite restaurant. Sarah organized a surprise party with my book club friends and several neighbors, including Gloria. The party was small but heartfelt, held in my backyard under string lights that Sarah had hung from the oak trees Frank and I had planted when we first moved to the house. My friends mingled with my family, sharing stories about me that my children had never heard, and I felt a strange sense of worlds colliding in a positive way. Your friends really love you, Sarah said as we stood together watching Helen tell an animated story about our book club's disastrous attempt to reenact a scene from the novel we were reading. I can see why you've become so close to them. They've been there for me when I needed them, I said simply. They remember what matters to me and show up consistently. That means a lot when you're my age. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. I'm beginning to understand that. I think I took for granted that you would always be there for us, but I never thought about what we were giving back to you. The conversation was encouraging, but I remained cautious about reading too much into it. Sarah had always been the most emotionally intelligent of my children, and she had always been good at saying the right things. The real test would be whether her actions matched her words over the long term. As autumn progressed into winter, my children maintained their improved communication patterns. The Sunday calls from Rebecca became something I looked forward to, filled with genuine conversation rather than perfunctory check-ins. Michael's emails evolved from brief updates to longer messages that revealed his personality and sense of humor in ways I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. Sarah's consistent contact felt increasingly natural and less forced. But I also noticed that they never directly asked about the will or suggested that their changed behavior should result in changed inheritance plans. This restraint impressed me and suggested that they might genuinely understand that rebuilding trust was more important than securing financial benefits. In December, as I prepared for another Christmas with Helen's family, Sarah called with an unexpected proposition. Mom, I know you've made plans for Christmas, and I don't want to interfere with those. But Rebecca, Michael, and I were wondering if you might be willing to have a small family dinner sometime between Christmas and New Year's. Nothing elaborate, just the 4 of us talking and spending time together. The invitation surprised me because it came without pressure or guilt, with explicit acknowledgement of my existing plans and respect for my autonomy. That sounds nice, I said. What did you have in mind? We were thinking we could come to you, Sarah said. We could bring all the food and handle all the cleanup. We just want to spend some quiet time together as a family, without the pressure of a big holiday celebration. I agreed to the dinner, curious to see how this new dynamic would play out in person. The gathering was scheduled for December 28th, giving everyone time to celebrate the holidays with their immediate families before coming together for this more intimate occasion. Christmas with Helen's family was once again wonderful, filled with warmth and inclusion and genuine affection. But this year, I found myself also looking forward to the family dinner with my children, something I wouldn't have imagined possible 6 months earlier. The dinner on December 28th exceeded my modest expectations. My children arrived bearing bags of groceries and a clear plan for preparing a meal together in my kitchen. They worked cooperatively, assigning tasks and cleaning as they went, and the atmosphere was relaxed and comfortable in a way our family gatherings hadn't been in years. Rebecca made her father's famous meatloaf recipe, something she hadn't prepared since Frank's death. Michael surprised me by revealing that he had learned to make homemade bread during the pandemic, and he brought fresh loaves that filled the house with the comforting smell of baking. Sarah prepared a salad with ingredients from her own garden, and a vinaigrette Frank had always loved. We ate in the dining room at the table where we had shared thousands of meals over the decades, but the conversation was different from our old family gatherings. Instead of catching up on surface-level news, we talked about deeper topics, what we had learned about ourselves through therapy, how we had changed as people over the past year, what we valued most in our relationships with each other. "I want to apologize again for the years of taking you for granted," Rebecca said as we finished the main course. "But more than that, I want you to know that I'm genuinely grateful for the wake-up call. I've learned so much about myself and about what it means to maintain meaningful relationships." Michael nodded in agreement. "I never realized how much work you were doing to keep our family connected. I always thought that loving someone was enough, but I've learned that love has to be demonstrated through actions, not just felt in your heart." Sarah reached across the table and took my hand. "I know we can't undo the years of neglect, Mom, but I hope you can see that we're genuinely committed to being better family members. Not because of your will, but because we finally understand what we were missing." I felt tears pricking at my eyes, not from sadness but from the unexpected joy of being truly seen and appreciated by my children. "I can see that," I said, "and I'm proud of the work you've all done to understand these issues. It takes courage to examine your own behavior and admit that you need to change." The evening ended with all of us washing dishes together and making plans for regular family dinners throughout the coming year. As my children prepared to leave, each of them hugged me with an intensity that felt different from our previous perfunctory embraces. "Thank you for not giving up on us," Rebecca whispered as she held me tight. "Thank you for teaching us how to be better," Michael added. "Thank you for loving us enough to demand better from us," Sarah said through tears. After they left, I sat in my living room and reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had taken place over the past year. My decision to change my will had been motivated by hurt and disappointment, but it had ultimately led to a deeper understanding between my children and me. They had learned to value our relationship, and I had learned to advocate for my own worth and dignity. The question that remained was whether this transformation was permanent, and whether it warranted reconsideration of my estate planning decisions. But that was a question for another day. For now, I was content to enjoy the unexpected gift of genuine connection with my children, and the hope that our relationships would continue to grow stronger with time. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal that seemed to permeate every aspect of my life. Gloria and I started our morning walks earlier to take advantage of the longer days, and the conversations we shared during those rambles had deepened into the kind of friendship I had thought was no longer possible at my age. She had become not just a neighbor but a confidant, someone who understood the complexities of rebuilding life after loss and the delicate process of learning to trust again. It was during one of these walks in late March that Gloria brought up something that had been weighing on her mind. "Lois," she said as we paused to admire the daffodils beginning to emerge in the town square, "I've been thinking about your situation with the will. Your children have been consistently attentive for almost 6 months now. Have you given any thought to whether their behavior warrants reconsideration?" The question had been lurking in the back of my mind for weeks, but I had been reluctant to examine it too closely. My children's sustained effort to rebuild our relationships had been genuine and meaningful, but I remained uncertain about whether 6 months of improved behavior was sufficient to undo years of neglect. "I have been thinking about it," I admitted. "But I keep wondering whether they would maintain this level of attention if they knew the will wasn't going to change regardless of their behavior. Are they being good children because they've learned to value our relationship? Or because they're still hoping to influence my estate planning?" Gloria nodded thoughtfully. "That's a fair question. But consider this. Does it matter what their initial motivation was if the outcome has been positive for everyone involved? Sometimes people need external incentives to recognize patterns they couldn't see on their own." "But what happens when the external incentive is removed?" I asked. "If I change the will back and they revert to their old behavior, then I'll know their recent efforts were purely calculated." "True," Gloria said. "But if you never give them the opportunity to prove themselves without the threat hanging over them, you'll never know if their change was genuine either." The conversation stayed with me throughout the day, And that evening I found myself pulling out the folder where I kept copies of my current will and the letters I had written to my children explaining my decision. Reading through those documents now, after months of improved family relationships, felt like revisiting a painful chapter of my life that had somehow transformed into something more hopeful. I called Margaret Chen the next morning and scheduled an appointment to discuss my options. Margaret greeted me warmly when I arrived at her office, and I could see the curiosity in her eyes as she settled into her chair across from me. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, "when you called, you mentioned wanting to discuss potential changes to your estate plan. I take it your family situation has evolved since we last spoke?" "It has," I said, and I found myself telling her about the family therapy sessions, the sustained improvement in communication, and the genuine efforts my children had made to understand and address their behavior. Margaret listened attentively, taking notes and asking clarifying questions about the timeline and nature of the changes. "It sounds like there has been significant improvement," she said when I finished. "But I can hear the uncertainty in your voice. What are your concerns about making changes to the will?" "I'm afraid that if I restore their inheritance, they'll interpret that as validation that their recent efforts were sufficient, and they might gradually return to their old patterns," I said. "But I'm also afraid that if I don't acknowledge their growth, I might be punishing them for past behavior even though they've genuinely changed." Margaret leaned back in her chair and considered my dilemma. "Have you considered a middle ground approach? There are several ways to structure an estate plan that would acknowledge their efforts while still protecting against the possibility of future neglect." She explained several options. I could restore their inheritance, but include provisions that required continued demonstration of care and respect. I could create a graduated inheritance plan that increased their bequests over time, based on sustained good behavior. I could establish a family foundation that would require their ongoing participation and cooperation to access funds. Another option, Margaret said, would be to restore a portion of their inheritance while still leaving significant amounts to the charities you chose. This would show that you value their efforts, while also honoring your commitment to organizations that supported you during difficult times. The conversation gave me much to think about, and I left Margaret's office with several draft proposals to review. But before making any decisions about the will, I knew I needed to have another honest conversation with my children about our relationships and their expectations. I called Rebecca that Sunday during our regular weekly conversation and asked if she, Michael, and Sarah would be willing to meet with me to discuss something important. "Is everything okay, Mom?" she asked, and I could hear the concern in her voice. "Everything is fine," I assured her. "I just want to have a family conversation about where we stand with each other. I think it's time for us to talk openly about the past year and what we've all learned." We arranged to meet the following Saturday at my house, and I spent the week thinking about how to approach the conversation. I wanted to acknowledge their growth while also being honest about my ongoing concerns. I wanted to discuss the possibility of changing the will without making any promises or creating false expectations. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of soft rain that makes everything look fresh and green, and I found myself nervously rearranging furniture and checking my appearance in the mirror more than necessary. At precisely 2:00, all three of my children arrived together, having apparently coordinated their travel to present a united front. We gathered in the living room where we had held so many family meetings over the years, but the atmosphere was different now. Instead of the tension and defensiveness that had characterized our previous discussions, there was a sense of mutual respect and genuine care. "I asked you all to come today because I want to talk about the progress we've made as a family and what that might mean for the future," I began. "Over the past 6 months, you've all made tremendous efforts to rebuild our relationships, and I want you to know how much that means to me." Rebecca leaned forward in her chair. "Mom, we know we had a lot of ground to make up. The consistency of our contact might feel calculated to you, but I want you to know that it's become one of the most meaningful parts of my week. I look forward to our Sunday calls in a way I never expected." Michael nodded in agreement. "I've learned that staying in touch doesn't have to be a burden if you approach it as an opportunity to connect, rather than an obligation to fulfill. Writing those weekly emails has helped me understand your life better and feel more connected to you as a person, not just as my mother." Sarah's contribution was characteristically emotional. I keep thinking about all the years I wasted being too busy or too distracted to maintain our relationship properly. I can't get those years back, but I'm grateful for the chance to do better now. I felt a familiar tightness in my throat as I listened to their words. I can see and feel the difference in how you approach our relationships now, I said. But I need to ask you something difficult. If I told you today that I was never going to change my will back, that the charities would remain the beneficiaries of my estate, regardless of how our relationships evolved, how would you feel? The question hung in the air for a moment, and I watched their faces carefully for signs of disappointment, anger, or calculation. Rebecca was the first to respond. I would be disappointed, she said honestly. Not because of the money, but because it would feel like you didn't believe our changes were genuine. But I would also understand your decision, and it wouldn't change how I want to conduct our relationship going forward. Michael took longer to formulate his response. I think I would question whether I had done enough to earn back your trust. But I also think I would continue calling and visiting because these connections have become important to me for their own sake. Sarah's answer was the most revealing. I would be heartbroken, she said, but not for the reasons you might expect. I would be heartbroken because it would mean you still saw us as the selfish, neglectful people we used to be, instead of the people we're trying to become. Their responses felt authentic and thoughtful, lacking the manipulation or entitlement I might have expected. But I knew that the real test would come when I revealed my actual plans. I've been meeting with my attorney to discuss possible changes to the will, I said. Not because I felt obligated to reward your recent behavior, but because I wanted to explore whether there were ways to acknowledge your growth while still honoring my values and protecting against future disappointment. I explained the various options Margaret had outlined, watching their reactions carefully. They listened without interrupting, and I could see them processing the implications of each possibility. What appeals to you most? Rebecca asked when I finished. I'm leaning toward a compromise approach, I said. I want to restore a portion of your inheritance while still leaving significant amounts to the charities that supported me. I also want to include provisions that would protect those charitable bequests, even if our relationships deteriorate in the future. That sounds fair, Michael said. And honestly, knowing that you're still prioritizing the organizations that were there for you makes me proud of you. It shows that you're not just reacting emotionally, but making decisions based on your values. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. I think it's perfect, Mom. It acknowledges our efforts while also honoring the people who didn't forget about you when we did. The conversation continued for another hour, with all of us discussing what we had learned about ourselves and each other over the past year. We talked about the importance of consistent communication, the difference between loving someone and showing love through actions, and the work required to maintain meaningful relationships. I want to be clear about something, I said as our conversation wound down. Any changes I make to the will are not contingent on your continued good behavior. I'm making these decisions based on who you are today, not on promises about who you'll be tomorrow. If you revert to your old patterns, I'll be disappointed, but the will won't change again as a result. We understand, Rebecca said. And we hope you understand that our commitment to being better family members isn't contingent on being reinstated in your will. We've learned too much about the value of genuine relationships to go back to taking you for granted. After my children left, I sat in my quiet house and reflected on the conversation. Their responses had been more mature and thoughtful than I had expected, and I felt cautiously optimistic about the sustainability of the changes they had made. But I also knew that only time would truly test the depth of their transformation. The following week, I met with Margaret again to finalize the changes to my will. We drafted a new document that left 40% of my estate to my 3 children, to be divided equally among them, while 60% would go to the animal shelter, literacy program, and scholarship fund. The charitable bequests were protected by ironclad language that would prevent them from being challenged or reduced under any circumstances. This feels like a thoughtful balance, Margaret said as we reviewed the final document. You're acknowledging your children's efforts, while also honoring your commitment to organizations that supported you. And the protected charitable bequests ensure that your values will be reflected in your final gifts regardless of any future family dynamics. I signed the new will on a Tuesday morning in May, exactly 1 year after I had signed the document that removed my children entirely. The irony of the timing wasn't lost on me, and I felt a sense of closure as I put my signature on the pages that would govern the distribution of my estate. That afternoon, I called each of my children to let them know that I had made changes to my will, and that they would receive copies of the relevant sections in the mail. I didn't go into detail about the specific amounts or percentages, but I wanted them to know that their efforts had been acknowledged. Their reactions were gratifyingly focused on the relationship rather than the money. Rebecca thanked me for giving them a chance to prove themselves. Michael expressed hope that we could continue building on the progress we had made. Sarah cried and told me how much our renewed closeness meant to her. Summer brought new routines and deeper connections. My children maintained their consistent communication patterns, but the contact began to feel more natural and less effortful. Rebecca's Sunday calls evolved into genuine conversations about our lives, our thoughts, and our experiences. Michael's emails became longer and more personal, filled with stories about his work and observations about his daily life. Sarah's frequent texts and calls reflected a genuine interest in my well-being and activities. In July, Sarah surprised me by asking if she could spend a long weekend with me, not for any special occasion, but simply because she wanted to experience my life in Millbrook more fully. "I realized I know very little about your daily routine or your friends," she said. "I'd like to understand better how you spend your time and what makes you happy." The weekend visit was a revelation for both of us. Sarah accompanied me to the animal shelter and met the staff who had become like family to me. She attended a book club meeting and charmed my friends with her intelligence and humor. She joined Gloria and me for our morning walks and helped me tend to my garden. "I had no idea how full your life was," she said on Sunday evening as we sat on my back porch watching the sunset. "I always pictured you sitting alone in this house waiting for us to call, but you have this whole community of people who care about you and rely on you. I built this life after I realized I couldn't depend on you and your siblings for all my social and emotional needs," I said gently. "It was one of the healthiest things I've ever done for myself." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "I can see that. And I'm grateful that you didn't just sit around feeling sorry for yourself. You created something beautiful here." The weekend reinforced my growing confidence that the changes in our family dynamics were genuine and sustainable. Sarah's curiosity about my life felt authentic, and her appreciation for the community I had built seemed sincere. In August, Rebecca organized a surprise celebration for the first anniversary of my changed will. "I know this might seem like an odd thing to celebrate," she said when she called to invite me to dinner, "but that decision was the catalyst for all the positive changes in our family. I want to acknowledge that." The dinner was held at a restaurant that had special meaning for our family, the place where Frank and I had celebrated our anniversary every year, and where we had taken the children for milestone birthdays and graduations. Rebecca had invited Michael and Sarah, and the four of us sat at a corner table sharing stories and reflecting on the journey we had taken together. "I want to propose a toast," Michael said, raising his wine glass. "To Mom, for having the courage to demand better from us, and to all of us, for being willing to do the hard work of rebuilding these relationships." As we clinked glasses, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected gift of genuine family connection. The path had been painful and uncertain, but it had led to something more authentic and meaningful than anything we had shared before. The conversation that evening touched on many topics, but what struck me most was how naturally we discussed difficult subjects that we had once avoided. We talked about Frank's death and how it had affected each of us differently. We discussed the challenges of aging and the importance of family support systems. We acknowledged the mistakes we had all made and the lessons we had learned. "I want you to know something, Mom," Rebecca said as the evening wound down. "Even if you had never changed your will back, I think we would have continued working on our relationships. What we've discovered this year isn't about inheritance, it's about connection." "I believe that now," I said, "but I'm not sure I would have believed it a year ago." September brought another milestone, my 74th birthday. For the first time in 5 years, I felt genuine excitement as the date approached. My children had been planning something special for weeks, coordinating with my friends and neighbors to create a celebration that would honor both my relationships with them and my place in the broader community. The party was held in my backyard, which had been transformed with lights and flowers and tables decorated with photos spanning my entire adult life. My book club friends mingled with my children. The animal shelter staff shared stories with my neighbors, and Gloria served as an unofficial hostess, making sure everyone felt included and comfortable. "This is what a life well lived looks like," Helen said as we stood together watching the diverse group of people who had gathered to celebrate me. "Look at all the lives you've touched, all the relationships you've nurtured." But what moved me most was a speech that Sarah gave near the end of the evening. "My mother taught us many lessons over the years," she said, addressing the assembled crowd. "But the most important lesson came when she stopped teaching us through words and started teaching us through actions. She showed us that love requires effort, that relationships need attention, and that everyone deserves to be treated with respect and appreciation." As the party wound down and guests began to leave, each of my children took time to speak with me privately. Rebecca thanked me for my patience during their learning process. Michael expressed amazement at the community I had built around myself. Sarah promised that she would never again take our relationship for granted. "This was the birthday I dreamed of having," I told them as we stood together in my kitchen, cleaning up the remnants of the celebration. "Not because of the party, but because I felt truly seen and appreciated by all of you." The following months passed in a pleasant rhythm of family connection and community involvement. My children's consistency never wavered, and their attention began to feel completely natural rather than effortful. They started including me in their major decisions, seeking my advice and genuinely considering my input. They remembered not just my birthday but other important dates, and they began creating new traditions that honored our renewed closeness. In November, I received an unexpected call from Dr. Vance, the family therapist we had worked with during the most difficult period of our rebuilding process. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, "I've been following up with families I've worked with, and I wanted to check in on how things are going with your children." I told her about the sustained improvements in our relationships, the changes to my will, and the genuine closeness we had developed over the past 18 months. She listened with what I could only describe as professional satisfaction. "What you've accomplished is remarkable," she said. "Most families who come to me with these kinds of issues either stay stuck in their old patterns or make temporary changes that don't last. The fact that your children have maintained consistent behavioral changes for over a year suggests that the transformation is genuine." "What made the difference?" I asked. "Several factors," she said. "Your willingness to set clear boundaries, their willingness to do individual therapy work, and the family's commitment to honest communication. But I think the most important factor was your decision to prioritize your own dignity and well-being. That gave your children a clear choice. Step up and be better family members, or lose the relationship entirely." As Christmas approached, I felt a sense of completeness that had been missing from my life for years. My children proposed that we spend Christmas Eve at my house, with each family contributing to the meal and all of us staying overnight to create the kind of extended celebration we had enjoyed when they were young. Christmas Eve was magical in ways I had forgotten were possible. We cooked together, played games, shared memories, and created new traditions that reflected who we had become as individuals and as a family. The grandchildren, who had been somewhat distant from me in previous years, seemed to sense the change in family dynamics and included me in their activities with genuine affection. As I tucked myself into bed that night, surrounded by the gentle sounds of my family sleeping in the rooms around me, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought us to this point. The decision to change my will had been born from hurt and disappointment, but it had ultimately led to healing and transformation. The new year brought fresh possibilities and continued growth. My children's spouses, who had previously seemed somewhat wary of family gatherings, began reaching out to me independently, and I found myself developing genuine friendships with them. The grandchildren started calling me regularly and including me in their important moments. In February, Rebecca surprised me by asking if I would consider moving to a smaller house closer to one of my children. "We've all been talking," she said, "and we're concerned about you living alone as you get older. We want to make sure you have support nearby if you need it." The conversation touched me deeply because it reflected genuine care for my well-being rather than guilt or obligation. We discussed various options, including the possibility of building a small apartment attached to one of their homes, or finding a retirement community where I could maintain independence while having access to support services. "I'm not ready to make any major changes yet," I told them, but I'm touched that you're thinking about my future needs. Let's revisit this conversation in a year or two and see how I'm feeling then." As spring returned once again, I found myself marveling at the richness of my life and the depth of my relationships. The animal shelter had named their new cat socialization room in my honor. The library had created a special reading garden where I conducted my children's programs. The scholarship fund had established an annual award in Frank's memory that would help local students pursue their educational dreams. My children had become true partners in my life, sharing both joys and concerns in ways that felt balanced and mutual. Gloria remained my closest friend and confidant, but she was no longer my only source of deep connection. I had multiple circles of support and affection that overlapped and reinforced each other. On a warm May morning, exactly 2 years after I had first changed my will, I sat in my garden with a cup of coffee and a sense of profound gratitude. The roses Frank had planted were blooming magnificently, the birds were singing in the trees he had chosen, and my phone was buzzing with messages from children who had learned to love me not out of duty but out of genuine affection and respect. I thought about the woman I had been 2 years earlier, sitting alone on her forgotten birthday, feeling invisible and unvalued. That woman had made a decision that changed everything, not because she wanted to punish her children, but because she finally understood her own worth. The journey from that moment to this one had been difficult and uncertain, but it had led to something beautiful and authentic. The story wasn't finished, of course. Relationships require ongoing attention and care, and there would undoubtedly be challenges and setbacks in the years ahead. But I had learned that I was worthy of love and respect, that I could demand better treatment without being unreasonable, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their poor behavior. Most importantly, I had learned that it's never too late to start over, to build new relationships, and to insist on being valued for who you are rather than what you can provide. The will had been just a piece of paper, but the decision to change it had been a declaration of my own worth, and that declaration had changed everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.